So you've probably heard the phrase, you get what you measure. Within an organization, as a result, what can often happen is that softer things, or things that are not being measured very well or very often, get deprioritized in exchange for an over-prioritization of things that are being measured all the time. When it comes to completing work, what can often happen is an over-focusing on make line go down, which basically just means that you are burning down your tasks in as complete a way as possible. So when you finish a sprint or finish a milestone, surprise, surprise, the tasks all got completed, and the group that is being project managed by the person who is doing this has completed everything they were supposed to do. But here's the dangerous thing, is it actually done? If you checked everything off on the checklist, if you did every task, is the overarching goal actually being accomplished? And that's where this disconnect often starts to arise. You've checked every single checkbox on your list, but you still don't have the feature you were trying to get. What often happens if you are over-focusing on make line go down at the expense of other things is you get a corruption of what done means. This is especially true in the middle of a project where different phases of completion are kind of fuzzy. This is in a shippable state isn't really that arguable. We could argue about whether or not it's good enough, and we should, but is it ready to ship? Is it not crashing? Is it performant? Is it ready to go? Those are relatively objective. But in the middle, where you have some degree of completion stages along the way, especially for much larger pieces of content like entire missions, it can become really easy for the completion state to be argued that yes, we did in fact finish this to orange box or white box or banana, because the completion state is kind of fuzzy. And then what you end up getting is this kicking of the can down the road as work that was supposed to be done at banana stage gets pushed down to coconut stage and then gets kicked down the road again to albatross stage, and then finally all of this work ends up still having to be done at the very end when it needs to be done before you can actually ship the thing. You might end up seeing is you have certain teams that have these almost laser straight completion graphs, sprint after sprint after sprint, because they're burning down their tasks. But what's actually happening is that they're just delaying work that needs to be done. They're arguing that they're more done than they actually are successfully each time. And then at the end, when it doesn't matter what their excuses are anymore, suddenly the velocity of that team, which you thought was this incredibly predictable thing, just flatlines as suddenly all that work they've been delaying has to be done and there's no more excuses. What can you do to avoid this? So I'm going to argue that there are two slightly contradictory seeming things that can be done. For really large pieces of content, I think your phases need some sort of soft definition alongside the checklist aspects. If the banana phase says that the mission needs to run at least 15 frames a second, because it's early, doesn't need to be completely performant, that's good. But in addition, you probably want something like a dev can see that this has the potential to be fun. Or we can put this in front of a usability tester and they're able to make their way through the mission. Or something like that where it's soft, but it also has an emotional underpinning where it's evoking words like fun or engaging or understandable, so that even though that is arguable, there's this feeling of norms that underpins it. It's not going to get you all the way there, especially with those really early phases where I can see what this mission might someday be is really coming down to how thick your dev goggles are. But once you get into the middle phases where I'm willing to put this in front of a focus test, or I would show this to the press, or this could ship if it had to, those kinds of evocative statements become a good backstop for the rest of the work that you're doing. But the second thing I think is really important is to have those checklist items. If you think that at Coconut you should be running at 22 frames a second, enforce that. Now, what can happen here is in the early days of your project, when everyone is full of piss and vinegar, they likely are going to put metrics in place that are unrealistically high. So they might say at Coconut, your second to last phase, that you need to be running at 30 frames a second or 45 frames a second, when that doesn't really make a ton of sense. So if you are going to put these checklist items in place, and I think you should, be prepared to revisit them on some regular cadence, at least once a year, probably more often than that, and re-examine if these bars you put in place still make sense now that the reality of going through these phases is coming to fruition. And if necessary, adjust them. Now, if you are adjusting 45 frames a second down to 20 frames a second, know that you are also pushing some work down the road. So that may require you to re-examine your scheduling overall. A lot of this is a symptom of larger teams. As you get bigger, there is a temptation to do more in parallel, to have more work in flight. One of the things that attracts me to philosophies like Hourglass or Pile of Sand is this focus on picking something and getting it to done. If you take each individual thing that you're working on to done before you work on the next thing, then you don't really need to worry about things getting arbitrarily declared more done than they are, because there's really only one phase done. For larger teams, this isn't really practical because there are things that need to be done in parallel to some degree. You need to have things in flight because you have level artists and level designers, and then you also have potentially tech artists going into that space, and you have audio people, and you have testers, and you have a whole bunch of people that need to work on a piece of content as it moves through the various phases. But the fewer different phases you have, the less things have a possibility to get lost in the weeds. So I still believe that a very powerful way to address this issue is to have less things in flight. Take things to done, or at least to more done, and don't do everything to kind of done and then come back and then do everything to kind of more done. Do fewer things to mostly done, or even completely done if at all possible, because things will get stuck, get lost, get ignored, get lied about a lot less if there are less places for them to get lost in. Going back to how we opened, you get what you measure. So if you are celebrating passing these different phases, then you are going to get a team that is focused on passing these phases. If that's what you want, then you need to make sure that these phases are giving you what you want along the way. If you have those more emotional, more evocative statements backstopping them, then that might be what you want. But if you can't get there, you may be better served to focus on measuring other things, or at least adding other measurements that you can then broadcast to the team. So you don't have a team that's hyper-focusing on things that may not be providing you a ton of value. Within an organization, I'm not sure that you ever can completely get away from you get what you measure. And maybe that's not even unfortunate. Maybe that's what we want. But we can go in with eyes wide open and use this to our advantage. So measure what you want, measure the behaviors that you want, measure the game that you want, and it will push the team towards that. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. Have you ever worked for someone that was so focused on what the burn down chart looked like that they were fudging the numbers? I've led people whose burn down charts were straight lines, which is, granted, an incredibly obvious red flag. What are some experiences you've had here? What are some techniques you've used to take advantage of you get what you measure? Let me know that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.